Preface and Chapter 1, Part 1 of 30 Years a Slave, From Bondage to Freedom, the Institution of Slavery as Seen on the Plantation and in the Home of the Planter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. 30 Years a Slave, From Bondage to Freedom, the Institution of Slavery as Seen on the Plantation and in the Home of the Planter, by Lewis Hughes. Preface. The institution of human slavery, as it existed in this country, has long been dead. And, happily for all the sacred interests which it assailed, there is for it no resurrection. It may, therefore, be asked to what purpose is the story which follows, of the experiences of one person under that dead and accursed institution. To such question, if it be asked, it may be answered that the narrator presents his story in compliance with the suggestion of friends, and in the hope that it may add something of accurate information regarding the character and influence of an institution which for 200 years dominated the country, exercising a potent but baneful influence in the formation of its social, civil, and industrial structures, and which finally plunged it into the most stupendous civil war which the world has ever known. As the enlightenment of each generation depends upon the thoughtful study of the history of those that have gone before, everything which tends to fullness and accuracy in that history is of value, even though it be not presented with the adjuncts of literary adornment or thrilling scenic effects. Chapter 1, Part 1, Life on a Cotton Plantation. Birth, sold in a Richmond slave pen. I was born in Virginia in 1832, near Charlottesville, in the beautiful valley of the Rivanna River. My father was a white man and my mother a negress, the slave of one John Martin. I was a mere child, probably not more than 6 years of age as I remember, when my mother, 2 brothers, and myself were sold to Dr. Lewis, a practicing physician in the village of Scottsville. We remained with him about 5 years when he died, and in the settlement of his estate, I was sold to one Washington Fitzpatrick, a merchant of the village. He kept me a short time when he took me to Richmond by way of canal boat, expecting to sell me. But as the market was dull, he brought me back and kept me some 3 months longer, when he told me he had hired me out to work on a canal boat running to Richmond, and to go to my mother and get my clothes ready to start on the trip. I went to her as directed, and when she had made ready my bundle, she bade me goodbye with tears in her eyes, saying, "My son, be a good boy, be polite to everyone, and always behave yourself properly." It was sad to her to part with me, though she did not know that she was never to see me again, for my master had said nothing to her regarding his purpose, and she only thought, as I did, that I was hired to work on the canal boat, and that she should see me occasionally. But alas, we never met again. I can see her form still as when she bade me goodbye. That parting I can never forget. I ran off from her as quickly as I could after her parting words, for I did not want her to see me crying. I went to my master at the store, and he again told me that he had hired me to work on the canal boat and to go aboard immediately. Of the boat and the trip and the scenes along the route I remember little. I only thought of my mother and my leaving her. When we arrived at Richmond, George Pullen, a nigger trader, as he was called, came to the boat and began to question me, asking me first if I could remember having had the chicken pox, measles, or whooping cough. I answered yes. Then he asked me if I did not want to take a little walk with him. I said no. "Well," said he, "you have to go. Your master sent you down here to be sold, and told me to come and get you and take you to the trader's yard, ready to be sold." I saw that to hesitate was useless, so I at once obeyed him and went. A slave market. The trader's establishment consisted of an office, a large showroom, and a yard in the rear enclosed with a wall of brick 15 feet high. The principal men of the establishment were the proprietor and the foreman. When slaves were to be exhibited for sale, the foreman was called to the office by means of a bell and an order given him to bring into the showroom work of but a few minutes, and the women were placed in a row on one side of the room and the men on the other. Persons desirous of purchasing them passed up and down between the lines, looking the poor creatures over and questioning them in about the following manner: "What can you do? Are you a good cook? Seamstress? Dairymaid?" This to the women, while the men would be questioned as to their line of work. "Can you plow? Are you a blacksmith? Have you ever cared for horses? Can you pick cotton rapidly?" Sometimes the slave would be required to open his mouth that the purchaser might examine the teeth and form some opinion as to his age and physical soundness. And if it was suspected that a slave had been beaten a good deal, he would be required to step into another room and undress. If the person desiring to buy found the slave badly scarred by the common usage of whipping, he would say at once to the foreman, "Why, this slave is not worth much. He is all scarred up. No, I don't want him. Bring me in another to look at." Slaves without scars from whipping and looking well physically always sold readily. They were never left long in the yard. It was expected that all the slaves in the yard for sale would be neatly dressed and clean before being brought into the showroom. It was the foreman's business to see that each one was presentable. Slave whipping as a business. Whipping was done at these markets or traders' yards all the time. People who lived in the city of Richmond would send their slaves here for punishment. When anyone wanted a slave whipped, he would send a note to that effect with a servant to the trader. Any petty offense on the part of a slave was sufficient to subject the offender to this brutal treatment. Owners who affected culture and refinement preferred to send a servant to the yard for punishment to inflicting it themselves. It saved them trouble, they said, and possibly a slight wear and tear of feeling. For this service, the owner was charged a certain sum for each slave, and the earnings of the traders from this source formed a very large part of the profits of his business. The yard I was in had a regular whipping post to which they tied the slave and gave him 9 30, as it was called, meaning 39 lashes as hard as they could lay it on. Men were stripped of their shirts in preparation for the whipping, and women had to take off their dresses from the shoulders to the waist. These whippings were not so severe as when the slaves were stripped entirely of their clothes, as was generally the case on the plantations where slaves were owned by the dozen. I saw many cases of whipping while I was in the yard. Sometimes I was so frightened that I trembled violently, for I had never seen anything like it before. Sold in the market. I was only in the yard a short time before I was bought by one George Reed, who lived in Richmond. He had no wife, but an old lady kept house for him and his 3 sons. At this time he had a place in the post office, but soon after I came there he lost it. He then moved into the country upon a farm of about 1,000 acres, enclosed by a cedar hedge. The house was a plain frame structure upon a stone basement and contained 4 rooms. It was surrounded with shrubbery and was a pleasant country seat, but I did not like it here. I grieved continually about my mother. It came to me more and more plainly that I would never see her again. Young and lonely as I was, I could not help crying, oftentimes for hours together. It was hard to get used to being away from my mother. I remember well Aunt Sylvia, who was the cook in the Reed household. She was very kind to me and always spoke consolingly to me, especially if I had been blue and had had one of my fits of crying. At these times, she would always bake me an ash cake for supper, saying to me, "My child, don't cry. Aunt Sylvia will look after you." This ash cake was made of cornmeal and water, a little salt to make it palatable, and was baked by putting it between cabbage leaves and covering it with hot ashes. A sweeter or more delicious cake one could not desire, and it was common upon the tables of all the Virginia farmers. I always considered it a great treat to get one of these cakes from Aunt Sylvia. The appellations of aunt and uncle for the older slaves were not only common among the blacks, but the whites also addressed them in the same way. On the auction block. I was sick a great deal. In fact, I had suffered with chills and fever ever since Mr. Reed bought me. He, therefore, concluded to sell me, and in November 1844 he took me back to Richmond, placing me in the exchange building, or auction rooms, for the sale of slaves. The sales were carried on in a large hall, where those interested in the business sat around a large block or stand, upon which the slave to be sold was placed, the auctioneer standing beside him. When I was placed upon the block, a Mr. McGee came up and felt of me and asked me what I could do. "You look like a right smart nigger," said he. "Virginia always produces good darkies." Virginia was the mother of slavery, and it was held by many that she had the best slaves. So when Mr. McGee found I was born and bred in that state, he seemed satisfied. The bidding commenced, and I remember well when the auctioneer said, $380 once, twice, and sold to Mr. Edward McGee. He was a rich cotton planter of Pontotoc, Mississippi. As near as I can recollect, I was not more than 12 years of age, so did not sell for very much. Prices of slaves. Servant women sold for $500 to $700, and sometimes as high as $800 when possessing extra qualifications. A housemaid, bright in looks, strong and well-formed, would sell for $1,000 to $1,200. Bright mulatto girls, well-versed in sewing and knitting, would sometimes bring as high as $1,800, especially if a Virginian or a Kentuckian. Good blacksmiths sold for $1,600 to $1,800. When the slaves were put upon the block, they were always sold to the highest bidder. Mr. McGee, or Boss, as I soon learned to call him, bought 60 other slaves before he bought me, and they were started in a herd for Atlanta, Georgia, on foot. Started for a cotton plantation. Boss, myself, and 10 others met them there. We then started for Pontotoc, Mississippi. On our way, we stopped at Edenton, Georgia, where Boss sold 21 of the 60 slaves. We then proceeded on our way, Boss by rail and we on foot, or in the wagon. We went about 20 miles a day. I remember as we passed along, every white man we met was yelling, "Hooray for Polk and Dallas!" They were feeling good, for election had given them the men that they wanted. The man who had us in charge joined with those we met in the hurrahing. We were afraid to ask them the reason for their yelling, as that would have been regarded as an impertinence, and probably would have caused us all to be whipped. My Mississippi home. At length, after a long and wearisome journey, we reached Pontotoc, McGee's home, on Christmas Eve. Boss took me into the house and into the sitting room, where all the family were assembled, and presented me as a Christmas gift to the madam, his wife. My boss, as I remember him, was a tall, raw-boned man, but rather distinguished in looks, with a fine carriage, brilliant in intellect, and considered one of the wealthiest and most successful planters of his time. Mrs. McGee was a handsome, stately lady about 30 years of age, brunette in complexion, faultless in figure, and imperious in manner. I think that they were of Scotch descent. There were 4 children, Emma, Willie, Johnny, and Jimmy. All looked at me and thought I was a spry little fellow. I was very shy and did not say much, as everything was strange to me. I was put to sleep that night on a pallet on the floor in the dining room, using an old quilt as a covering. The next morning was Christmas, and it seemed to be a custom to have eggnog before breakfast. The process of making this was new and interesting to me. I saw them whip the whites of eggs on a platter to a stiff froth. The yolks were thoroughly beaten in a large bowl, sugar and plenty of good brandy were added, and the whites of the eggs and cream were then stirred in. A little nutmeg grated on top of each glass when filled for serving. This was a delicious drink, and the best of all was, there was plenty of it. I served this to all the family, and as there were also visiting relatives present, many glasses were required, and I found the tray so heavy I could hardly carry it. I helped myself after the service was finished, and I was delighted, for I had never tasted anything so fine before. My boss told me I was to wait on the madam, do any errand necessary, attend to the dining room. In fact, I was installed as general utility boy. It was different from the quiet manner of life I had seen before coming here. It kept my spirits up for some time. I thought of my mother often, but I was gradually growing to the idea that it was useless to cry, and I tried hard to overcome my feelings. Plantation life. As already stated, it was Christmas morning, and after breakfast I saw the cook hurrying, and when I went out into the yard, everywhere I looked, slaves met my view. I never saw so many slaves at one time before. In Virginia, we did not have such large farms. There were no extensive cotton plantations as in Mississippi. I shall never forget the dinner that day. It was a feast fit for a king, so varied and lavish was the bill of fare. The next attraction for me was the farm hands getting their Christmas rations. Each was given a pint of flour of which they made biscuit, which were called Billy Seldom, because biscuit were very rare with them. Their daily food was cornbread, which they called Johnny Constant, as they had it constantly. In addition to the flour, each received a piece of bacon or fat meat, from which they got the shortening for their biscuit. The cracklings from the rendering of lard were also used by the slaves for shortening. The hands were allowed 4 days off at Christmas, and if they worked on these days, as some of them did, they got 50 cents a day for chopping. It was not common to have chopping done during the holidays. Some planters, however, found it convenient thus to get it out of the way for the work which came after Christmas. The Great House. I soon became familiar with my work in the house and with the neighborhood, as I often had to carry notes for boss to neighboring farmers, as well as to carry the mail to and from the post office. The Great House, as the dwelling of the master was called, was 2 stories high, built of huge logs, chinked and daubed and whitewashed. It was divided from front to rear by a hall 25 feet long and 12 feet wide, and on each side of the hall, in each story, was one large room with a large fireplace. There were but 4 rooms in all, yet these were so large that they were equal to at least 6 of our modern rooms. The kitchen was not attached to the main building, but was about 30 feet to the rear. This was the common mode of building in the South in those days. The 2 bedrooms upstairs were very plain in furnishings, but neat and comfortable, judged by the standard of the times. A wing was added to the main building for dining room. In rear of the kitchen was the milk or dairy house, and beyond this the smokehouse for curing the meat. In line with these buildings, and still further to the rear, was the overseer's house. Near the milk house was a large tree, and attached to the trunk was a lever, and here was where the churning was done, in which I had always to assist. This establishment will serve as a sample of many of those on the large plantations in the South. The main road from Pontotoc to Holly Springs, one of the great thoroughfares of the state and a stage route, passed near the house and through the center of the farm. On each side of this road was a fence, and in the corners of both fences, extending for a mile, were planted peach trees, which bore excellent fruit in great profusion. House servant and errand boy. My first work in the morning was to dust the parlor and hall and arrange the dining room. It came awkward to me at first, but after the madam told me how, I soon learned to do it satisfactorily. Then I had to wait on the table, sweep the large yard every morning with a brush broom, and go for the mail once a week. I used to get very tired, for I was young and consequently not strong. Aside from these things which came regularly, I had to help the madam in warping the cloth. I dreaded this work, for I always got my ears boxed if I did not or could not do the work to suit her. She always made the warp herself and put it in, and I had to hand her the thread as she put it through the harness. I would get very tired at this work, and like any child, wanted to be at play. But I could not remember that the madam ever gave me that privilege. Saddling the horse at first was troublesome to me, but Boss was constant in his efforts to teach me, and after many trials I learned the task satisfactorily to the master and to bring the horse to the door when he wished to go out for business or pleasure. Riding horseback was common for both ladies and gentlemen, and sometimes I would have to saddle 3 or more horses when Boss, the madam, a friend or friends desired a ride. Bird hunting parties were common and were greatly enjoyed, by the young people especially. Boss always invited some of the young people of the neighborhood to these parties, and they never failed to put in an appearance. Williams, Bradford, and Freeman were the sons of rich planters, and were always participants in this sport, and their young lady friends joined in it as onlookers. The young men singing and whistling to the birds, I, in the meantime, setting the net. As soon as I had got the net in order, they would approach the birds slowly, driving them into it. There was great laughter and excitement if they were successful in catching a fine flock. Cruel treatment. I was but a lad, yet I can remember well the cruel treatment I received. Some weeks it seemed I was whipped for nothing, just to please my mistress's fancy. Once, when I was sent to town for the mail and had started back, it was so dark and rainy my horse got away from me, and I had to stay all night in town. The next morning when I got back home I had a severe whipping, because the master was expecting a letter containing money and was disappointed in not receiving it that night, as he was going to Panola to spend Christmas. However, the day came and all the family went except me. During the time they were gone, the overseer whipped a man so terribly with the bullwhip that I had to go for the doctor, and when Dr. Henningford, the regular family physician, came, he said it was awful, such cruel treatment, and he complained about it. It was common for a slave to get an over-threshing, that is, to be whipped too much. The poor man was cut up so badly all over that the doctor made a bran poultice and wrapped his entire body in it. This was done to draw out the inflammation. It seems the slave had been sick and had killed a little pig when he became well enough to go to work, as his appetite craved hearty food, and he needed it to give him strength for his tasks. For this one act, comparatively trivial, he was almost killed. The idea never seemed to occur to the slaveholders that these slaves were getting no wages for their work, and therefore had nothing with which to procure what at times was necessary for their health and strength, palatable and nourishing food. When the slaves took anything, the masters called it stealing, yet they were stealing the slaves' time year after year. When Boss came home, he was called on by the town officials, for the case had been reported to them. Boss, however, got out of it by saying that he was not at home when the trouble occurred. The poor slave was sick from his ill treatment some 4 or 5 months, and when he recovered, there was a running sore left on his body from the deep cuts of the whip, which never healed. I cannot forget how he looked. The sore was a sickening sight, yet when he was able to walk, he had to return to work in the field. I had not been in Pontotoc very long when I saw the hounds run a slave, by name Ben Lyon. Old Ben, as he was called, ran away and had been gone a week when he was seen by a woman who told on him, and then I was sent to get the man who had trained dogs, or hounds as they were called. The dogs ran the slave about 10 miles when they lost track at a creek, but he was caught that night in a farmer's house getting something to eat. Instructions in Medicine. After some time, Boss began to tell me the names of medicines and their properties. I liked this and seemed to grasp the idea very well. After giving me a number of names, he would make me repeat them. Then he would tell me the properties of each medicine named, how it was used, and for what purpose, and how much constituted a dose. He would drill me in all this until I knew it, and in a short time he would add other names to the list. He always showed me each medicine named, and had me smell and carefully examine it that I might know it when seen again. I liked this, and used to wish that I was as wise as my master. He was very precise, steady, and gentle in any case of sickness, and although he had long retired from the medical world, all recognized his merit wherever he went. I used to go to the woods and gather slippery elm, alum root, and the roots of wild cherry and poplar, for we used all these in compounding medicines for the servants. The overseer, whippings, and other cruelties. The overseer was a man hired to look after the farm and whip the slaves. Very often they were not only cruel, but barbarous. Every farmer or planter considered an overseer a necessity. As a rule, there was also on each plantation a foreman, one of the brighter slaves, who was held responsible for the slaves under him, and whipped if they did not come up to the required task. There was, too, a forewoman, who, in like manner, had charge of the female slaves, and also the boys and girls from 12 to 16 years of age, and all the old people that were feeble. This was called the trash gang. Ah, it would make one's heart ache to see those children, and how they were worked. Cold, frosty mornings, the little ones would be crying from cold, but they had to keep on. Aunt Polly, our forewoman, was afraid to allow them to run to get warm for fear the overseer would see them. Then she would be whipped, and he would make her whip all of the gang. At length, I became used to severe treatment of the slaves, but every little while something would happen to make me wish I were dead. Everything was in a bustle. Always there was slashing and whipping. I remember when Boss made a change in our overseer. It was the beginning of the year. Riley, one of the slaves, who was a principal plower, was not on hand for work one Monday morning, having been delayed in fixing the bridle of his mule, which the animal, for lack of something better, perhaps had been vigorously chewing and rendered nearly useless. He was, therefore, considerably behind time when he reached the field. Without waiting to learn what was the reason for the delay, the overseer sprang upon him with his bullwhip, which was about 7 feet long, lashing him with all his strength, every stroke leaving its mark upon the poor man's body, and finally the knot at the end of the whip buried itself in the fleshy part of the arm, and there came around it a festering sore. He suffered greatly with it until one night his brother took out the knot, when the poor fellow was asleep, for he could not bear anyone to touch it when he was awake. It was awful to hear the cracking of that whip as it was laid about Riley. One would have thought that an ox team had gotten into the mire and was being whipped out, so loud and sharp was the noise. I usually slept in the dining room on the floor. Early one morning an old slave by the name of Uncle Jim came and knocked at the window, and upon my jumping up and going to him, he told me to tell Boss that Uncle Jim was there. He had run away some time before, and for some reason had returned. Boss, upon hearing the news, got up and sent me to tell the overseer to come at once. He came, and, taking the bullwhip, a cowhide, and a lot of peach tree switches, he and Boss led Uncle Jim back into the cow lot on the side of the hill, where they drove 4 stakes in the ground, and laying him flat on his face, tied his hands and feet to these stakes. After whipping him in this position all they wanted to, a pail of strong salt and water was brought, and the poor fellow was washed down. This washing was customary after whippings, as the planters claimed it drew out all the soreness and healed the lacerated flesh. Upon one occasion, the family being away, I was left extra work to do, being set to help 3 fellow slaves lay off the rows for planting corn. We did not get them quite straight. The deviation we made from the line was very little and could scarcely be seen even by an expert. But the least thing wrong about the work would cause any slave to be whipped, and so all 4 of us were flogged. The slave cabin. There was a section of the plantation known as the quarters, where were situated the cabins of the slaves. These cabins were built of rough logs and daubed with the red clay or mud of the region. No attempt was made to give them a neat appearance. They were not even whitewashed. Each cabin was about 14 feet square, containing but 1 room, and was covered with oak boards 3 feet in length, split out of logs by hand. These boards were not nailed on, but held in their places by what were termed weight poles, laid across them at right angles. There were in each room 2 windows, a door, and a large, rude fireplace. The door and window frames, or facings, were held in their places by wooden pins, nails being used only in putting the doors together. The interior of the cabins had nothing more attractive than the outside. There was no plastering and only a dirt floor. The furniture consisted of 1 bed, a plain board table, and some benches made by the slaves themselves. Sometimes a cabin was occupied by 2 or more families, in which case the number of beds was increased proportionately. For light, a grease lamp was used, which was made of iron, bowl-shaped, by a blacksmith. The bowl was filled with grease and a rag or wick placed in it, one end resting on the edge for lighting. These lamps gave a good light and were in general use among the slaves. Tallow candles were a luxury never seen in the great houses of the planters. The only light for outdoors used by the slaves was a torch made by binding together a bundle of small sticks or splinters. Cotton raising. After the selection of the soil most suitable for cotton, the preparation of it was of vital importance. The land was deeply plowed, long enough before the time for planting to allow the spring rains to settle it. Then it was thrown into beds or ridges by turning furrows both ways toward a given center. The seed was planted at the rate of 100 pounds per acre. The plant made its appearance in about 10 days after planting, if the weather was favorable. Early planting, however, followed by cold, stormy weather, frequently caused the seed to rot. As soon as the 3rd leaf appeared, the process of scraping commenced, which consisted of cleaning the ridge with hoes of all superfluous plants and all weeds and grass. After this, a narrow plow known as a bull tongue was used to turn the loose earth around the plant and cover up any grass not totally destroyed by the hose. If the surface was very rough, the hose followed instead of preceding the plow to unearth those plants that may have been partially covered. The slaves often acquired great skill in these operations, running plows within 2 inches of the stalks and striking down weeds within half an inch with their hose, rarely touching a leaf of the cotton. Subsequent plowing, alternating with hoeing, usually occurred once in 20 days. There was danger in deep plowing of injuring the roots, and this was avoided, except in the middle of rows in wet seasons, when it was necessary to bury and more effectually kill the grass. The implements used in the culture of cotton were shovels, hoes, sweeps, cultivators, harrows, and 2 kinds of plows. It required 4 months under the most favorable circumstances for cotton to attain its full growth. It was usually planted about the 1st of April, or from March 20th to April 10th, bloomed about the 1st of June, and the first balls opened about August 15th, when picking commenced. The blooms come out in the morning and are fully developed by noon, when they are a pure white. Soon after meridian, they begin to exhibit reddish streaks, and next morning are a clear pink. They fall off by noon of the second day. The cottonworm. A cutworm was troublesome sometimes, but the plants were watched very carefully, and as soon as any signs of worms were seen, work for their destruction was commenced. The majority of the eggs were laid upon the calyx and involucre. The worm, after gnawing through its enclosed shell, makes its first meal upon the part of the plant upon which the egg was laid, be it leaf, stem, or involucre. If it were laid upon the leaf, as was usually the case, it might be 3 days before the worm reached the bowl. But were the eggs laid upon the involucre, the worm pierced through within 24 hours after hatching. The newly hatched bollworm walks like a geometrical larva or looper, a measuring worm as it was called. This is easily explained by the fact that while in the full-grown worm the abdominal legs or prolegs are nearly equal in length, in the newly hatched worm the second pair are slightly shorter than the third, and the first pair are shorter and slenderer than the second, a state of things approaching that in the full-grown cottonworm, though the difference in size in the former case is not nearly so marked as in the latter. This method of walking is lost with the first or second molt. There is nothing remarkable about these young larvae. They seem to be thicker in proportion to their length than the young cottonworms, and they have not so delicate and transparent an appearance. Their heads are black and their bodies seem already to have begun to vary in color. The body above is furnished with sparse, stiff hairs, each arising from a tubercle. I have often watched the newly hatched boll while in the cotton fields. When hatched from an egg which had been deposited upon a leaf, they invariably made their first meal on the substance of the leaf and then wandered about for a longer or shorter space of time, evidently seeking a boll or flower bud. It was always interesting to watch this seemingly aimless search of the young worm, crawling first down the leaf stem and then back, then dropping a few inches by a silken thread, and then painfully working its way back again, until at last it found the object of its search, or fell to the ground where it was destroyed by ants. As the bollworms increase in size, a most wonderful diversity of color and marking becomes apparent. In color, different worms will vary from a brilliant green to a deep pink or dark brown, exhibiting almost every conceivable intermediate stage, from an immaculate unstriped specimen to one with regular spots and many stripes. The green worms were more common than those of any other color. A common variety was a very light green. When these worms put in an appearance, it raised a great excitement among the planters. We did not use any poison to destroy them, as I learned is the method now employed. End of Chapter 1, Part 1. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista.